All right, so for our first video, we're going to be talking about the characteristics of nonverbal communication. We're going to look at how nonverbal communication is inevitable. It is the primary conveyor of emotion, it's multi-channeled and ambiguous. And then we'll kind of end just with a reflection question, a knowledge application, and an exam prep question. So the first characteristic of nonverbal communication is that nonverbal communication is inevitable. What this means is that we cannot not communicate, as in you're always communicating a message. Whether this is intentional or not, we are communicating something about ourselves or what we think based on, it could just be like what we're wearing or maybe a physical action that we do. It could be our facial expression. It could be how you're sitting. There's so many ways, and we'll explore that when we get into the types of nonverbal communications video. But for now, it's just important that we understand that at all times, we are communicating something to people around us. So this connects, just to do a quick concept connection, this connects back to our perception chapter, right? People attend to messages that we put out there, even non-verbally, and then they put meaning to it through the process of interpretation. So that's something to be aware of at all times. You know, I know we can't be thinking about it constantly, but it is important that you are always putting out a message to others non-verbally. All right, so I have a quick example of this. This is like a physical, someone does an action and people apply meaning to it. So your classmate Austin is sitting in class and he yawns. So there's 3 classmates around him in his group and they all see him yawn and they all perceive this differently. One classmate might see this as boredom, another one might see it as fatigue, and then one might see it as a sign of disrespect. This is just a simple example of how people can see something that maybe was totally intentional. Austin may not have even thought about it, but they all applied meaning to it. So this is showing you that nonverbal communication is inevitable. The second characteristic is that nonverbal communication is the primary conveyor of emotions. And this means that we interpret how others feel almost entirely by their nonverbal messages. That means that someone can say something like, "I'm fine," but by that facial expression, you could probably know that they're not. And that's why even when people try to convince you, they're like, "No, I'm really okay." You're like, "No, what's going on? What's wrong?" And that's because 93% of emotional meaning of messages is usually conveyed nonverbally. So that's really important to realize that, especially if you want to be a strong communicator, that we need to understand how to align our nonverbal messages with our verbal messages. So here's a quick example for you. Your friend says, "I'm not upset." Oh wait, let me do that again. Your friend says, "I'm not upset," but you notice her high-pitched voice, her vocal pace, and how she slams her hands down when she says this. So your interpretation is most likely, she's clearly upset. So this is showing you, again, just to connect this back, this is the perception process. It can also be tied to culture because facial expressions, we'll learn in just a little bit, facial expressions and nonverbal messages sometimes differ from culture to culture. The next nonverbal characteristic that we should consider is that it's multi-channeled. And this means that we perceive meaning from a combination of nonverbal behaviors, so not just someone's facial expression, but we also pay attention to their voice tone or how they're sitting, their use of hands. We kind of use them all in conjunction to gather our perception of a message or our interpretation of that message. Another aspect that's really interesting is something called artifacts. And these are usually physical items that convey meaning about somebody. So this could be like a poster in your room. When I was growing up, I had a Sailor Moon poster, so you could probably guess about me that I liked anime. But that is a nonverbal message, right? I'm not really saying that to you, but when you come into my space, you can tell, oh, from this artifact, probably Han likes anime. We do this a lot with the things that we wear, the brand choices, all of those things. So we'll go more into how it's multi-channeled and how all these work together. But we have to understand that aspect about nonverbal communication first. So here's another example. While sitting in class before an exam, you ask your friend how he's doing. He quickly responds, "I'm fine." But you notice bags under his eyes, a venti Starbucks cup on the table, his quick rate of speech, a half smile, and a higher pitched voice. Probably your interpretation of that message is, my friend is stressed out about the test and he's probably really tired from studying. The fourth characteristic of nonverbal communication is that it's ambiguous. This is kind of like in the last chapter where we learned about language being abstract and arbitrary. It's kind of along those same lines. Ambiguous just means that it can kind of fluctuate or change among people or cultures. Very few nonverbal messages mean the exact same thing. In fact, especially when it comes to, like, we're going to talk about gesturing in the next video, and when it comes to gestures, that especially means a lot of different things. But one of the only things that's kind of the same across cultures are just the basic emotional type things, like smiling, right? Like that is usually, like, across the globe, if someone's happy, they smile, which I think is really cool. Or if they're sad, they cry. So those basic emotions are the ones that can kind of transcend. But even then, when we start layering on more context on top of that, people still show those same emotions differently across cultures. So it is based a lot on culture and co-cultures, and also just your past experiences and your preferences. So not everyone in a co-culture is going to use the same expressions or the same nonverbal messages the exact same. So even though some can kind of show, like, maybe clothing, that could be one that shows that you're part of a generation, which is a co-culture. That could be one, but not everybody in that generation are all going to wear those same clothes. So, okay, some examples we can look at would be like eye contact. And in an individualistic society, making eye contact is a sign of respect. Whereas a collectivist society, it's a sign of disrespect. So, like, growing up in America, I was always taught, if I was getting in trouble, my mom or dad was going to say, "Hey, look at me," right? They want me to have eye contact. Well, in some societies, that's actually considered rude, and you would actually want to look down or look away to show that maybe you're remorseful or that you're respecting them. So we want to think about that when we think about different cultures and how they show their nonverbal messages, which I think really does have a big influence on our ability to be good intercultural communicators. All right, and so then the concept connections here would be the dimensions of cultural variation. So remember that every culture has different variations, and there's several that were listed in chapter 3. So you'll want to go back and kind of look at those, because that's going to be important for this chapter too. Okay, pause the video and answer the following questions. When you're ready, press play. Okay, here are our answers. Go ahead and pause the video to check your work, and when you're ready, move on to the last slide, the reflection question. Consider a time when you misunderstood someone. In what ways did nonverbal communication contribute to the misinterpretation?